do you think Pablo Escobar was afraid of no one? You think about the judges he bought, the ministers he confronted, the colonels who fell one after another, and you assume that man lived without ever trembling. But for 26 months, the most powerful criminal on the planet lived alongside a threat that didn't come from the police or from Cali or from Washington. It came from within. This is the story of Rubén Darío Londoño Vázquez, alias La Yuca. And what you're about to discover changes what you think you know about the crime that split Colombia in two. There's a date, July 18th, 1986, and a 30-second scene in Envigado. It's at the end of this account, and it explains why the assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla remains unpunished. To understand who La Yuca was, you first have to travel south of the Aburrá Valley, to a town that almost never appears in documentaries. La Estrella, a village wedged between mountains half an hour from downtown Medellin with steep streets, unplastered brick houses, and an economy that depended on workshops, brickyards, and transportation. In the 1970s, that territory became something more. It became a recruiting ground. From its neighborhoods came names that would later fill court files for a decade. Elkin Correa, Jorge Gonzalez, and the man the entire world would come to know as El Chopo. And out of there came Rubén Darío Londoño Vázquez as well, born in the mid-1950s into a family with no name and no backing. The organization didn't recruit at universities. It recruited where the state no longer reached. Londoño got in early, and he got in through the narrowest door there was: personal security. Years later, Maria Victoria Henao, the kingpin's wife, would describe with chilling precision how that first ring of protection was assembled. She wrote that as the fortune grew, so did the need to hire bodyguards, and that the first was Penina, followed by El Chopo, La Yuca, and Pasquin. She called them, in her own words, our shadows. That word says everything about the place Londoño occupied in that structure. He wasn't an employee or an outside contractor. He was one of 4 people who knew where the most wanted man in Colombia slept. He was inside the house, not at the door. And that closeness years later would become the problem. In the court documents, La Yuca always appears with a double description: driver and gunman. That combination is no minor detail. A kingpin's driver is the person who knows the routes, the schedules, the safe houses along the way, the names of the gatekeepers and the faces of the partners. The driver hears everything spoken in the back seat. And if he also carries out orders, then he doesn't just listen. He also knows who ordered what, when, and for how much. For years, Londoño accumulated that kind of information, the kind that's never written down anywhere and exists only inside a man's head. In an organization built on silence, that human archive was worth more than any laboratory, and it also weighed more. By the early 80s, however, the cartel's ambition was no longer purely financial. Escobar wanted formal power. In 1982, he entered the Chamber of Representatives as an alternate for a movement of his own, the Liberal Renewal Movement, a machine built on cash, floodlit soccer fields, and houses handed over to families who had spent 20 years living on top of a garbage dump. That movement was no vanity project. It had a departmental command, zone coordinators, campaign chiefs, and its own candidates spread across all of Antioquia. The goal was simple and brutal at the same time: stop buying officials and start producing them. It wasn't about bribing the state, it was about being the state. And this is where the life of Rubén Darío Londoño takes the turn no screenwriter would have dared invent. The bodyguard became a candidate. His name appeared printed on the Liberal Renewal Movement's ballot lists, and in the March 1984 elections, he was elected as a full council member for the 84 to 86 term. Not an alternate, a full member. A man who drove the kingpin's car and answered to the organization's most delicate orders, had just received credentials signed by Colombia's electoral authority. He was around 28 years old. He was going to sit in a municipal council in the Medellin metropolitan area with a salary, official minutes, and a vote. The gunman no longer had to hide from the state. Now, he was part of it. That experiment had a specific epicenter, Envigado, a judge named Tulio Manuel Castro Gil was the first to see it clearly, and he saw it while investigating something else entirely. Reconstructing the killing of the Minister of Justice, he found that in that town's council there were 3 figures from the liberal renewal movement in constant communication with the men who carried out the attack. The names were Ruben Dario Londoño Vázquez, Juan Fernando Maya Restrepo, and Alba Marina Escobar Gaviria, the kingpin's sister. 3 pieces placed on the same board, in the same governing body, in the same year. This wasn't corruption in the classic sense, with briefcases and envelopes under the table. It was something else, far more ambitious and far harder to dismantle. It was the Mafia sitting in the chair, not buying it. That project had an enemy with a first and last name, and he came from the least expected place, Congress itself. In August 1983, a young minister of justice named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla decided to do something that simply wasn't done in Colombia. He publicly named the origin of the money financing national politics and turned the spotlight on the representative from Antioquia who was handing out houses in Medellin and appearing in magazines as a benefactor. Lara spoke of dirty money, of bought campaigns, and of a businessman whose fortune no one could explain. In January 1984, cornered by the pressure, Escobar left Congress and lost the immunity that protected him. That day, he stopped being a politician and went back to being a case file. And behind that word, case file, there was another one spoken in low voices in Medellin: extradition. The treaty signed with the United States turned any of those men into a potential inmate in an American federal prison, where there were no buyable judges, no friendly guards, and no electoral machinery to serve as a shield. The kingpins could tolerate seizures, raids, and headlines. They could absorb losses in the millions without blinking. The one thing they were not willing to accept was boarding a plane bound for Miami. Lara Bonilla had become the visible face of that threat, and that's why the confrontation stopped being political and turned existential. The cartel's slogan fit into a single sentence: they preferred a grave in Colombia. That entire scaffolding began to shake on March 10, 1984, in a place where there were no councils and no credentials. The jungle of the Llanos del Yari, between Caquetá and Meta. A national anti-narcotics police unit, led by Colonel Jaime Ramirez Gomez and supported by American agents, came down on a complex christened Tranquilandia. What they found there wasn't a laboratory. It was an industrial city hidden beneath the canopy. 9 laboratories, 8 airstrips, some with lights for night operations. Small planes, a helicopter, power generators, chemical precursors by the ton, and 13.8 tons of white substance ready for shipment, valued at the time at $1.2 billion. Adjusted to today's figures, we're talking about more than $3 billion. It was the biggest blow ever struck in Latin America. But the seized material wasn't the worst part for the organization. Among the papers was a shipping ledger with the owner's initials, and those initials led directly to the owners of the merchandise. Colonel Ramirez would later testify under oath that Minister Lara Bonilla had told him several times that if anyone ever came after him, it would be the owners of what was found in the Yari. Lara knew exactly what he had done. He had turned a seizure figure into a list of names. And in that world, a list of names is a sentence. The minister was 38 years old. He had 7 weeks left. A few weeks later, a man who called himself Juan Perez checked into a hotel on Bogotá's 19th Avenue. He paid in cash, spent far more than an ordinary traveler, and ate lunch almost every day at a restaurant called La Fonda Antioqueña. He wasn't alone. Around him circulated a small group of young men, all with Paisa accents, all using false names, all moving through the same corridor of cheap hotels in the center of the capital. Juan Perez didn't exist. The registers of the Nueva Granada and Bogotá hotels held a signature that matched no citizen by that name. Behind that invented name was a sitting councilman. The operation had textbook logistics. They bought 2 motorcycles at a shop in the city, and one of the members left his fingerprints on the counter without imagining what that would mean months later. They rented a parking garage on that same 19th Avenue, the La Concordia garage, where they parked a green Renault 12. Inside that car, they stored the equipment: bulletproof vests, a machine gun, and 2 hand grenades. They spread rooms across 4 different hotels so no one would see the whole group in one place. And they set up a communication system with Medellin based on short calls from hotel phones. That system, designed to protect them, ended up exposing every one of them. The group had defined roles and nicknames that would later become notorious. A man who registered as John Jairo Franco turned out to be John Jairo Arias Tascon, alias Penina, a former inmate from Medellin and the future general coordinator of the cartel's armed structures. The buyer of the green Renault was Luis Alberto Cataño Molina, alias El Chopo, whose family told investigators bluntly that he worked as Escobar's bodyguard and looked after his son. There was a man who spoke in a whisper, his voice destroyed, whom everyone called El Ronco, Germán Alfonso Diaz, whose mission was to carry out the attack if the first team failed. And there was Juan Perez, the one who handled the money and coordinated. La Yuca wasn't going to fire a shot. La Yuca was directing. And there wasn't just one plan. There were several running in parallel, designed so that the failure of one wouldn't compromise the objective. While the 19th Avenue team followed the white Mercedes through northern Bogotá, another part of the group kept in contact with men in Pereira. The reason came out later. The minister was scheduled to travel to that city on May 1st, and a second opportunity was waiting for him there, a backup scenario in case the capital failed. Lara canceled that trip a few days beforehand because a senior officer warned him that a plot existed and that it could be carried out during the journey. He canceled the trip and saved Pereira. He saved nothing else. For the 2 young men who were going to do the dirty work, the truth was never on the table. Byron Alberto Velázquez Arenas, an 18-year-old from Antioquia who hadn't even finished 10th grade, and his partner Ivan Darío Guisao Alvarez, were told they had to eliminate a man who moved around in a white Mercedes and had stolen 4 kilos of merchandise. Nothing more. No office, no ministry, no last name. The agreed payment was 2 million pesos, with an advance of 20,000. 1984 pesos to start tailing a minister of justice. The organization didn't buy 2 hitmen. It bought 2 kids who had no idea who they were going after. The first attempt was on April 25th. That day they brought out the car, handed over the vests, the machine gun, and the 2 grenades, and the 2 young men rode north across Bogotá. Byron didn't know the city. He didn't know the names of the avenues and couldn't tell one traffic circle from another, so his partner guided him turn by turn, street by street. They passed in front of a 2-story office with a garage and a gate you could see all the way through. The white Mercedes wasn't there. They concluded the man had already left and returned the motorcycle without firing a single shot. That April afternoon, Colombia's Minister of Justice came within 5 minutes of dying and never knew it. He had 5 days left. On Sunday the 29th, they traveled from Medellin a second time. On Monday, April 30th, at the end of the workday, someone confirmed to them that everything had already been settled in Medellin. They stopped by the office first. The Mercedes wasn't there. It was 10 or 15 minutes past 7 in the evening. They understood the man had already left and headed toward his home. Under a bridge at a traffic circle, they caught up to him, the white Mercedes out front with an escort truck behind. Byron pulled the motorcycle up alongside and his partner began firing the machine gun at the rear window. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, Minister of Justice of Colombia, fell in the back seat of his own car in northern Bogotá on an ordinary Monday. The entire country changed that night. What happened in the minutes that followed is the reason we know this story today. The bodyguards chased the motorcycle. Guisao was gunned down during the escape, and Byron Velázquez, wounded, was captured a few blocks from the scene. The organization had planned every detail except one: that the driver would survive. 72 hours later, on Thursday, May 3rd, that 18-year-old was questioned in bed number 251 at the police clinic. He talked for hours. He gave dates, hotels, restaurants, parking garages, nicknames, the exact route of the 2 motorcycles, and the false names of the men who had hired him. He knew almost nothing. But the little he knew was enough to bring the whole thing down. While that young man was talking in a hospital bed 400 kilometers away, something was happening that would later become judicial evidence. That same night, without waiting for the next day's headlines, the cartel's top bosses scattered from their ranches and their homes. Planes, cars, borders. Within hours, men who until that Monday had lived under their own names behind open doors became invisible. Escobar, who still retained certain legal privileges from his recent time in Congress, also failed to appear to give a statement. An innocent man with immunity would have sat down to testify and walked out. He chose to disappear that very night. The judges took note. No one flees a crime he didn't see coming. From then on, the investigation became an exercise in patience. Agents went one by one through the hotels on 19th Avenue, the restaurants and the shops. They built composite sketches with the employees. They traced every call made from the rooms. And one of those calls led them to a phone in Medellin registered to a woman named Maria Morelia Vasquez. When questioned, the woman said without drama that during those days she had received several calls from her son in Bogotá. Her son's name was Rubén Darío Londoño, and he had a pending case in a court in Itagüí. The investigators went to the court, requested the file, and pulled a signature. They compared it with the one Juan Perez had left at the hotels. The handwriting experts didn't hesitate for a second. The composite sketch confirmed the rest. Juan Perez was Rubén Darío Londoño Vasquez, and Rubén Darío Londoño Vasquez was no anonymous criminal. He was a candidate for Pablo Escobar's political movement in La Estrella and a sitting councilman. That discovery completely transformed the nature of the case. Until that moment, the authorities were investigating a group of armed men who had come from Antioquia. From that moment on, they were investigating a political structure with institutional representation. The distance between the trigger and power had just been reduced to zero. The man who coordinated the assassination held credentials from a popular election. One by one, the remaining names fell through tiny mistakes. One member was identified by the fingerprints he'd left at the shop where they bought the motorcycles, and that's how it emerged that the Luis Javier Rodriguez in the records was actually Luis Javier Ruiz. El Ronco was betrayed by his own voice. The employees at the parking garage and the restaurant remembered perfectly a man who spoke in a whisper, and that description, cross-checked against police files, produced a real name. Another, nicknamed El Negro, was located through the calls he made to Pereira. None of them fell because of a confession. They all fell through routine, through administrative details, through papers signed without thinking. The perfect crime came apart with hotel receipts. The phones kept talking. Another of the calls made from Bogotá led to La Estrella, to the house of Luis Alberto Cataño, El Chopo, the same man who had bought the green Renault where the weapons were stored. Another led to a Medellin address linked to Juan Fernando Maya, who had run for the Envigado Council in '84 as an alternate to Alba Marina Escobar Gaviria. And another was registered to Maria Victoria Escobar de Henao, another of the Kingpin's sisters. In a single call log appeared the personal security detail, the political movement, and the immediate family of Pablo Escobar. It wasn't a map of suspicions, it was an organizational chart. With that material, Judge Tulio Manuel Castro Gil did what no Colombian official had ever done before. He called Pablo Escobar Gaviria to trial as the mastermind behind the killing of a minister of justice. He based the decision on 7 linked pieces of circumstantial evidence. Lara's head-on opposition to dirty money, the reopening of every dormant case against the former congressman, the number of men placed at the plan's disposal, the proven relationships between Cataño Molina, Londoño Vasquez, and the Kingpin's political movement, the enormous sums Londoño spent in Bogotá, the gang's calls to Escobar's home in Medellin, and revenge for the Tranquilandia raid. 7 indications, and one of them had a name of its own. Judge Castro Gil never lived to see the trial. On July 23, 1984, 3 months after the assassination, he finished teaching his law class at Santo Tomas University and took a taxi home. They intercepted him at Caracas Avenue and 47th Street. Despite repeated threats, his security detail had been withdrawn a few days earlier. The most important case file in the country was orphaned in a matter of seconds. And that pattern, the key person who disappears just as their signature is about to carry weight, would repeat itself so many times in this case that it stopped looking like coincidence. That file already had a name of its own: the Law of Silence. Soon afterward, it was the turn of Dora Emperatriz Torres Sanchez, the partner of Guisao, the man who had fired on the minister. She could tell who had hired her partner, how much he was paid, and who handed him the weapon. She never got the chance to testify. She was eliminated in Medellin on August 3, 1984, at the exact moment when the 77th Criminal Investigation Judge Luis Antonio Lizarazo was arriving in the city to question her. Not a day earlier, not a week later. The same day. That kind of precision isn't improvised. It requires real-time information on a judge's movements. Someone inside the judicial apparatus was passing word. And this is where the figure of Ruben Dario Londoño becomes different from that of any other man in the cartel. The gunmen were replaceable, and everyone knew it, starting with them. Inconvenient witnesses could be eliminated, bought off, or made to vanish without the country ever finding out. But Layuca was neither of those two things. Layuca was at the same time a named co-perpetrator of the assassination and a sitting public official with valid credentials. He was the only piece on the board that physically connected the trigger to the kingpin's politics, inside an institution of the Colombian state. If he ever sat on a witness stand and talked, neither money nor bullets would be enough to repair the damage. He wasn't a dangerous man because of what he could do. He was dangerous because of what he could say. For the next 26 months, he lived through one of the most absurd situations in Colombian judicial history. He had been a fugitive since the very day of the assassination, with an active arrest warrant and his name printed in the most closely watched case file in the country. And at the same time, his credentials as a full council member remained in force, corresponding to a term that didn't expire until 1986. The state was hunting him with one hand and recognizing him with the other. He moved around the southern Abura Valley with his own security detail, protected by a network of informants that included uniformed officers and backed by the political machine he himself had helped build. Not a single operation found him in 2 years. He wasn't hiding in the jungle. He was hiding inside the system. And that situation had a legal consequence worth understanding because it's the heart of this entire story. A fugitive defendant can be tried in absentia, and in absentia he is only convicted or acquitted on paper. A captured defendant is another matter. He sits down, he's asked questions, and he answers. The difference between those two situations was, for Pablo Escobar, the difference between remaining an inconvenient businessman and becoming the proven mastermind behind the killing of a minister. All it would take was for some police unit to get lucky one early morning in the southern Abura Valley. All it would take was for Londoño to decide to negotiate his freedom. The entire empire depended on one man keeping his mouth shut. And that man already had reasons to be resentful. About what went on behind closed doors in that period, versions still circulate today that are repeated in Medellin as truth and that no case file confirms. It's said the bodyguard became ungovernable, that he started moving around with 6 armed men of his own and walking into cartel meetings with his own security, a gesture that in that world had only one possible reading. It's said he questioned the split of the money out loud in front of other lieutenants and asked why some supplied the casualties while another collected the profits. It's said he went so far as to suggest the boss had gone soft. And it's said that the boss, who never responded in the heat of the moment, smiled that time, ended the meeting, and never slept easy again. The street never provided proof. It provided something harder to erase: consistency. Because that version fits with what is documented. It fits with a man who had risen from the security detail to a council seat, who had his own political contacts, his own informants, and his own money. It fits with someone capable of spending sums in Bogotá so conspicuous that investigators turned them into evidence. Above all, it fits with a detail that appears in the papers and that almost no one reads carefully. In the assassination file, there isn't just one Londoño. There's more than one, with the same surname, the same origin, and the same boss. We're not looking at a lone employee, we're looking at a small clan growing inside a large one. And in that organization, growing too much was a diagnosis. In June 1986, the case took a decisive turn. The Superior Tribunal of Bogotá ruled on the appeal against Castro Gil's order and overturned the referral to trial against Pablo Escobar, granting him a temporary dismissal along with 10 other defendants. The court held that there were no serious elements to conclude that the order had come from the defendant, that the recordings of the calls were never entered into the file, and that the connection between Londoño, Cataño, and the Kingpin's political movement existed only in the judge's mind. Escobar was cleared of that charge. But the dismissal was temporary, not permanent, and the next stage required something very specific. Expanded testimony. The file wasn't dead. It was sleeping with one eye open. And then came July 1986, one of the darkest months Medellin has ever lived through behind closed doors. On the 12th, Ramiro Arturo Correa Arroyave was eliminated, known in the underworld as Pablo Correa, a longtime cartel partner, co-owner of laboratories, and shareholder in professional soccer. 5 days before his death, he had sold his stake in 4 family companies. The version left in the archives is direct. His own partner eliminated him. Medellin understood the message without needing a translation. This wasn't a war against Cali or against the government. It was an internal cleanup, carried out on a schedule. And the schedule still had one open slot. On July 18, 1986, 6 days later, Rubén Darío Londoño Vázquez arrived at a spot in Envigado aboard an off-road vehicle. He was 30 years old. He had been a fugitive for 26 months, was still formally a councilman, and was the only one of the named co-perpetrators of the assassination still alive, free, and in Colombia. He opened the vehicle door and put one foot on the ground. He never got to take the second step. He was eliminated in that instant as he was getting out, and no state body ever managed to establish who fired. Not that year, not the next, not 4 decades later. In the file of the most investigated crime in the country's history, the death of the key witness remains filed the same way. A killing with no perpetrator. The official version that circulated at the time spoke of a shootout. The street version, the one told in Envigado's bars for the past 40 years, says something else. That the order came down from above, that men from the organization itself carried it out, and that the scene was staged afterward to look like something else. Neither version was ever proven. The only thing established with certainty is the outcome, and the outcome is devastating. With Londoño off the board, the only person capable of sitting before a judge and explaining with names and dates how Pablo Escobar's political movement and the gang that took the life of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla were exactly the same thing disappeared. That knowledge died with him at the door of an off-road vehicle. What came afterward shows just how effective that death was. In July 1987, the public hearing was finally convened in Bogotá, presided over by First Superior Judge Maria Inés de Garcia under extreme security measures. Of the 5 defendants who remained, only 4 could be tried: Byron Velázquez and El Ronco as present defendants, Pinina and El Chopo in absentia. The 5th name was erased from the list for a definitive reason. Rubén Darío Londoño Vázquez had been dead for a year. Weeks earlier, in August, Escobar and the other close defendants had moved from a temporary dismissal to a permanent one. The only one who ended up paying was the boy who drove the motorcycle. The rest of the list was completed with the same coldness. On November 17, 1986, 4 months after Layuca's death, Colonel Jaime Ramirez Gomez was driving back to Bogotá at the wheel of a white off-road vehicle. His wife was beside him. His 2 children were in the back seat. At the bridge over the Bogotá River between Mosquera and Fontibón, a green Renault 18 pulled alongside and opened fire. the man who had led Tranquilandia, who had warned Lara again and again about the plot, and who was due to expand his testimony in the new phase of the case, died in front of his family at 47 years old. He was 2 weeks away from receiving his promotion to general. His wife received that star 6 years later without him. The Londoño name, on the other hand, did not disappear from the criminal map. 4 years later, in the investigations into the killing of presidential candidate Bernardo Jaramillo Ossa, financial investigators found a series of checks issued from a bank to names within the cartel's armed structure. Pinina's wife appeared, El Chopo appeared, and Carlos Alberto Londoño Vázquez appeared, Rubén Darío's brother, named years earlier as a participant in the same assassination that had turned his brother into the most inconvenient man in Colombia. 6 years after La Yuca's death, his own family was still collecting at the same window. In that organization, no one retired. They were only replaced. And the model didn't die either. That invention a judge had detected in 1984, 3 pieces from the same movement seated on the council of a small town, turned out to be far more durable than its founders. Escobar fell on a Medellin rooftop in December 1993, but the collection and control structure built in Envigado outlived him, changed hands, and kept operating for decades under a name the whole country would later learn. Judge Castro Gil's investigation pointed at exactly that, and it was cut short on a Bogotá avenue before it could be completed. Men get replaced. The machinery doesn't. In the end, the man Pablo Escobar had to fear wasn't a colonel or a rival from Cali or a foreign agent. It was his own driver, the only one who knew the routes, the names, and the orders, and who also held state credentials that let him speak.